This is a cast which is designed to give some some discussion about scene 11. And here we have
Mrs. Buzzard
and Mr. Symons. And so we'll begin by looking at, let's get my pen ready, the context of this particular scene. Excuse my lovely handwriting. So in terms of where this is positioned in the play regarding narrative, what comments would we make there?
Well, obviously it's scene 11 and there are 15 scenes, so it's sort of about, I suppose, 2/3 of the way through the play. In terms of what's just happened before this scene that is important to understand, we have Galileo, of course, who has moved up to Florence and is living with the Medici family.
Great. So he's living in Florence with the Medicis.
And we have Galileo, who has been quite pivotal, I suppose, in terms of the dissolvement of the engagement between Ludovico and Virginia. That's just happened in scene 9. So they were due to be married, but essentially Ludovico has called off the engagement because Galileo is persistent in wanting to pursue his theories, which challenge the notion of the church. And Ludovico is a representation of the powerful within Italian society. And it is suggested that he's a member of the aristocracy because he's one of the landowners.
Yep.
His parents own like a big estate.
Yep.
And so, like on page 78, for example, he says that to Galileo, if His Holiness does die, Mr. Galilei, irrespective who the next pope is and how intense his devotion to the sciences, he will also have to take into account the devotion felt for him by the most respected families in the land.
Right, yeah.
So here he's trying to remind Galileo of the hold that the powerful has in society. So this is in scene 9.
The previous scene, yeah. Scene 9, sorry.
But this kind of just gives us some context as to why Ludovico walks out, and this, unfortunately, Galileo doesn't actually really care about his daughter here. He just sort of is only considering his appetite for science and pursuing new knowledge, and he doesn't really mind so much that his daughter's own welfare and happiness is going to be disadvantaged by the decision that he makes.
Yep. So it's a bit sad.
So boo for Galileo.
Yeah, boo.
We're being alienated again by Brecht.
Ah, yes, very good.
And then I suppose also in terms of context as well about the scene, scene 10, it says that, Galileo's doctrines spread amongst the common people.
Yeah, cool.
So his theories, are starting to grab society and gain interest.
Yep.
And therefore it suggests just how much of a threat they are to the church.
Yep.
And the quite comical scene with the ballad singers conveys that quite nicely. And then that brings us on to scene 11.
Yeah.
Where it's basically a discussion beginning with Virginia and Galileo, and then Vanni comes into the scene. And Vanni's a really interesting character, I think. He is a representative of the merchant class, which of course is a relatively new kind of class or group in society.
Yeah.
Given that, Venice and Italy itself was starting to become a major hub of trade.
Yeah.
And so he is representative of a group in society that has sort of the most to gain from Galileo publishing his findings. And essentially Vanni here is telling Galileo to be a hero.
Yeah.
And that if he's willing to be the hero that they need to create social change, then Vanni's going to show him loyalty and protect him. So he's encouraging him to come up north where he will be safe, telling him that you've got the northern Italian cities behind you, sir.
Okay, so the northern cities are almost like a refuge for that movement. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess if you think about it as well with like Holland and the Netherlands, that's where the telescope was invented, and they seem to be quite progressive up there. So I suppose because the church's influence isn't quite as strong there. And even when he was in Padua University, beginning.
Yeah.
Even though he was disgruntled with how little he was being paid,
Yeah.
he was safe. And Galileo is quite naive and only interested in, like, you know, himself and his discoveries, and therefore he was willing to sort of sacrifice that safety by moving to Florence, even though it was like full of monks, and people tried to warn him, but he doesn't listen.
Yeah, that's right.
And by the end of this scene, this is when he gets the Inquisitor arrives, and the Holy Inquisitor arrives essentially, and they're told that he's no longer safe, and they're going to take him to Rome to interrogate him.
Yeah.
So I suppose this is sort of like the climax in some ways of the plot, of the narrative, because he's tried to be safe and also pursue his knowledge, and that's going to be no longer possible.
Kind of foreshadows that the moment where we sit watching his proteges, and we hear the bells. So yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I suppose the recantation is probably the ultimate form of climax, but this is kind of leading and building up to it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the tension.
And also the disappointment, like the disappointment that his proteges feel.
Yeah.
Is echoed by the audience's own disappointment in Galileo. Brecht wants us to feel disappointed and betrayed by him, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose from a Marxist point of view, as a Marxist, Brecht, all of his kind of texts, particularly this one, are written through this Marxist lens.
Yeah.
So even though Karl Marx obviously wasn't invented in the Renaissance, it wasn't around in the Renaissance, so his theory couldn't have been invented. He's imposing his own kind of 20th century values on the Renaissance period.
Yeah.
And one of the ways he does that is through Vanni, which is why we're looking at this scene.
Yeah.
Because Vanni really has this vested interest in Galileo being brave, in being a hero. And he wants social change and social progress, which he feels is being stifled by the Catholic Church. But he needs someone who has the influence, the respect within the community in order to launch in that movement.
Right, and Galileo kind of presents himself as someone who has this social influence.
Yeah. And initially
potential.
he sort of seems to have that desire too.
Yeah.
Because he publishes his work vernacular, for the many rather than for the few. So he has this potential. Yeah.
That's cool. Okay, so we get into some of the analysis.
Yeah.
So we'll have a look here at this interaction between Galileo and Vanni. What jumps out to you in here? Sorry, excuse my pink commentary here, or my pink highlighting. We're going to go with yellow to make it different.
Sure. Well, I guess the very start with Virginia, she says, here's Mr. Vanni, the iron founder who designed the furnace for. Don't forget to thank him for those quails. So we kind of find out a little bit about Vanni. He's an iron founder. We really find out a bit more about his sort of social status and his class. And then they start talking about quails, which, might not seem particularly relevant. But obviously, as Brecht sort of uses food as a motif or a symbol within the play, they kind of represent, Galileo's gluttony. And it keeps reminding the audience of the desire to indulge in the senses, the consolations of the flesh, if you like.
Yeah, cool.
So then they talk about that, and then they start talking a little bit more. Vanni starts to try and bring it up, the reason why he's visiting, I suppose. He says they're blaming you for those pamphlets against the Bible that have been selling all over the place lately.
Right, so we see this kind of generation of social unrest against the church. Yeah, okay.
And then Galileo's response, I know nothing about pamphlets. The Bible and Homer are my preferred reading.
Yeah, I really like that line. So we'll just get this one in here again.
What do you like about it?
Well, I really like it because we have here the Bible, so obviously that's a religious text. So Galileo doesn't position himself actually in a spiritual way against the church itself. He's actually a religious person, and he has religious beliefs, and he doesn't see that those actually conflict with the scientific discoveries that he's been making.
Yeah.
So Homer's an interesting one, though.
So he doesn't see it as like mutually exclusive.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, which I think is kind of quite nice, but also shows his naivety, I suppose, that he, because of the way the church were constructed and how much influence they exerted, that he doesn't think that he doesn't kind of think through the implications, I suppose, and therefore he ends up getting into quite a difficult situation later on.
Yeah. So he really likes the, I guess, the spiritual beliefs or the theological beliefs of the church, but not necessarily the scientific beliefs of the church.
Yeah.
And he doesn't understand the political
the ramifications.
difficulties there that present. Yeah.
And Homer, I suppose, is that sort of representative, do you think, of the classical period?
Oh, yeah.
And the whole Renaissance was about rebirth and rediscovering the classics and an appreciation for that.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously it shows that Galileo is, well-read and learned and appreciates knowledge and learning.
Have I spelt Renaissance right there? Double N?
Yep.
Yay. AI?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent.
And then with Vanni here, you've got, even if they weren't so, I'd like to take this chance to say that we manufacturers are behind you. So the manufacturers are kind of representative of the lower class, or in Marx's sort of language, I guess, of the proletariat.
Yep.
I'm not the sort of fellow that knows much about the stars, but to me, you're the man who's battling for freedom to teach what's new. I really like that line.
Yeah.
Saying, battling for freedom. So he sees Galileo as this hero because he's willing to be brave and, to be bold in challenging, the notions of way of seeing things.
Yeah. And there's a nice little reference there to see why the VCAR chose this as a text for conflict, encountering conflict, because there's that word battling there. It's interesting the word battle has connotations towards like a war.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's like an ideological war.
Yeah, it's a clash of, different ideas and values and expectations for society.
Yeah.
You have the church who want to keep the society as it is, maintain the status quo at all costs, and that power that comes with it, and then all these other groups within society are starting to try and want to raise their voice and to change society, develop it, embrace technology and the new.
Yeah.
Cool. And then I guess further down, he says, Varney says, I should hope so. Do you realise that they've now got money markets in Amsterdam and London, commercial schools too, regularly printed papers with news in them? So these are all things that excite Varney, this type of society. It's open, it's inquisitive.
Hang on a second. Great. Let's go with... So the money markets, what's the significance of that?
Well...
My pen's not... There we go. No.
The money markets, I'm not entirely sure what they're referring to with the money markets there. But
it seems to be like economic freedoms.
Yeah.
So if you allow the peoples to, I don't know, trade in different ways, maybe that opens some things up economically.
I would imagine so. And then with regularly printed papers with news in them. So that's, I think that's really important. Spreading knowledge.
Yes, yeah.
And I imagine they would have to be published in like the vernacular.
Yep.
Rather than in Latin.
Yeah. Well, there's a link here which is interesting. Commercial schools, well, that links the financial to the educational.
Yeah, and I guess Varney feels like the current status quo is stifling him from creating more economic growth and progressing and rising up the social classes as well. So they're sort of interconnected. Yeah,
if you teach the lower class how to use money well, then that enables them with facilitates their social mobility.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then in this place, talking about Italy, we haven't even the freedom to make money.
Right.
So like you were saying before, Varney's being restricted by Italy at the moment and can't actually prosper and make as much money.
Yes. Cool.
They're against iron foundries because they imagine putting too many workers in one place leads to immorality.
That's amazing.
Which
So,
sounds ridiculous in one context.
leads to immorality.
So
Does that explain? Is that explained, or like what's?
that to me just kind of shows the level of superstition
Yes.
and devotion to faith that people have, and people just do that because that's what's been told for centuries without actually questioning.
I wonder also, there's that idea of Marxist and class consciousness. So if you put too many of the lower class together, they might actually figure out that they're all of the one class, and then figure out that their situation of suffering is not just them, but it's also...
Probably. That's probably Brecht coming through with his Marxism there. And then I think the line, I'll let you write that down.
Thanks.
I sink or swim with people like you, Mr. Galileo, is a wonderful quote.
Yeah.
And, a potential form that a student could do is actually be Vanni writing a letter to Galileo later in the play. I've had students do that before.
Cool.
And talk about the betrayal they felt after he recanted and so forth.
Cool. I'll put that in red, actually. So we've got their potential...
form of writing.
Yeah, context piece. So write as
Vanni to Galileo.
Yeah.
Maybe set later in the play, I suppose, after the recantation.
Yep. Post-recantation. Oh, nice. Yep. Explaining the consequences of the recantation, is that right?
Yeah. And, I suppose that hope, that lightness that was promised, or at least possible, is taken from Italy and Vanni himself.
Yeah.
So, when students have done that in the past, they've spoken a bit about Marxism quite a lot, obviously, and the idea of the social implications of Galileo's decisions.
Cool.
But then also, I guess, about Galileo's immorality as well, and his selfishness, and we can talk about, how much he cared about the consolations of the flesh, and as opposed to being a hero.
Yeah.
So I guess those two lines, are the kind of bookend the play. In the recantation, unhappy the land that has no heroes.
Yeah.
By Andrea, and then no, unhappy the land where heroes are needed kind of comes out. And obviously you'd be exploring Andrea's point.
Yeah.
That it's unhappy the land that has no heroes because Vanni needed Galileo to be his hero.
Yeah.
Without him, he suffered.
Wasn't a hero. Yeah.
Yeah. And you could also be someone like Andrea as well. But I think Vanni works quite well because of the fact that he's a representation of the merchant class.
Nice.
And it's kind of very credible, logical.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that scene 14 where we hear Andrea express his disappointment. So there's almost this link between Vanni. Actually, I'm gonna make a little spot for this. So follow the red. So over here, I think there's this link between Vanni and Andrea.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do a really brief kind of synopsis of that link between them, they're both disappointed.
Yeah. And I suppose...
For similar reasons.
Yeah.
But slightly different reasons.
I guess they both are disappointed for Italy and the lack of progress that's going to be made. And I guess, that symbolism of light and dark used by Brecht is beautiful.
Right.
Light. It's always morning when there's hope, when it's darkness, when, the hope's been evaporated.
Exactly. Whereas Andrea tends to be more academic. So he represents kind of the academic potential of Galileo's recantation, his...
But he too is of a lower class.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
He's a servant boy.
Yep. So he actually shows or conveys social mobility himself, which is it's kind of that glimmer of hope, isn't it? Even though Galileo's recanted and there is this tragic outcome of it, on the fact that Andrea has become someone who has social influence and is able to pursue science shows that movement from poverty to influence. I think, which is interesting. So, but Vanni represents the merchant class, but still part of the proletariat. And
I guess Andrea has more of a personal feeling of betrayal.
Yeah.
because he's grew up
Right.
with Galileo, and he was like a father figure to him almost.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, that's interesting. I was going to say the disappointment is actually seen on stage.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and your point of it being personal as well.
Mm.
Whereas the advantage of doing Vanni is that it's not seen on stage.
Yeah.
So you're not doing that overlap thing where you do something that's already been done on stage. You don't want... I think you all want to avoid that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess you want to be adding something kind of fresh and original in your context piece. Filling in a gap
Exactly.
is ideal.
And it's more... And I guess in that way it's more removed personally from... I mean, there's personal ramifications for Vanni himself.
Yes.
But it doesn't have that personal sense of betrayal.
Yeah, well, it's personal in the sense that his career may be limited.
Yes.
And he won't progress in the way that he'd like to.
Yes.
But for Andrea, it's a hurt.
Yeah.
He's been let down by someone who he admired. He
Admired.
was his hero,
Yeah, exactly.
and that is kind of is completely shattered.
Right. That's cool. So here's your context option: writing from Vanni for these reasons in particular.
Yeah, and I'd probably set it, in between, somewhere between,
Yep.
he's just recanted and when he's under house arrest.
Yes.
So probably somewhere in between, like, the last sort of 3/4 of the play, I suppose, in terms of setting it, because there's quite a time lapse between his recantation and
Yep.
the final scene when he's in his house, under house arrest and
Yep.
so forth.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Okay.
Scene 14 actually is what I was talking about. Yeah.
Cool.
Great.
Great.
In terms of back to the scene,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose also he says then after he said, "I sink or swim with people like you, Mr. Galileo."
Right. Yep. Yep.
He says, "If anybody ever tries launching anything against you, please remember
Oh,
you've
yeah.
friends in every branch of business.
Yeah.
You've got the northern Italian cities behind you, sir."
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this pen back. There we go.
So Vanni here, I guess, is reminding Galileo of
Yes.
his loyalty to him and how he will protect him if he continues to be a hero and champion their cause.
Yeah.
And Galileo's response, "As far as I know, nobody's thinking of launching anything against me,"
Yep.
I guess he's kind of quite dismissive here. And it also shows he's a bit misguided because he doesn't take Vanni's
I know.
Vanni
Yes.
seriously.
This is kind of ridiculous, isn't it?
And then by the very end of the scene, what happens? The Inquisitor arrives and he's taken to Rome. So,
Right. So it's almost immediately shown to be this absurd statement.
yeah.
Nobody's thinking of launching anything against me. He's completely clueless, isn't he?
Yeah. And then the next page, 88, Vanni says, "No." Galileo, "No." And then he says, Vanni says, "I think you'd be better off in Venice.
Yep.
Fewer
Right.
clerics, you could take up the cudgels from there. I'm travelling coach and horses, Mr. Galileo." And Galileo's response is particularly revealing. "I don't see myself as a refugee. I
Right.
like my comforts."
Okay, cool.
So we're reminded by Brecht here of Galileo's priorities. His
Yeah.
priorities are himself and the opulent kind of lifestyle that he's grown accustomed to. And even
Right.
just the word, a refugee, like it's kind of ridiculous as well because he wouldn't actually be a refugee.
Yeah.
He's being offered to go and stay in Venice.
You know what's interesting? I think you're right. We see that kind of that priority number one is himself. He's the man of the flesh. That's his first motivation. Is his own comforts. But his second motivation seems to be scientific knowledge.
Yep.
But even then, he sacrifices his, I guess, the romantic potential of his daughter for the sake of science itself. So it's almost like his
definitely.
daughter takes the third preference down. I'm not sure if the text comments on that much
Well,
at all.
she
but
may not even be third. She's probably further down the list. I
Oh,
mean,
really?
I think women in this play, are very marginalised in general
Yes.
and demeaned a lot of the time. Like I was talking about this with my class the other day. You think about the way he talks to Mrs. Sarti and he's quite Andrea unfortunately starts to dismiss his mother
I know.
as well, and
Yeah.
he's learnt that behaviour from Galileo.
Yep.
And Virginia at the beginning, when she takes an interest, he says, "Oh, run along to mass or whatever. It's not a toy."
I know.
So I think for Galileo, he's only really interested in people who show intellectual promise and who he considers to be intelligent. If they don't show his type of intelligence, he dismisses them and demeans them.
Yeah, because Virginia shows interest in this telescope. But then he kind of shrugs her off and... So maybe she could have been intelligent and she could have pursued academics, but...
Perhaps, but I think we don't really know that because Brecht only really shows her through that. She doesn't really get much of a voice in the play, and the language she does get, unfortunately, does portray her as fairly naive and simple, I suppose, in the way that she speaks.
Yeah.
That's why, I'd caution people against being Virginia, for example, in a creative piece, because it's difficult to achieve that complexity.
Complexity, because she's been denied an academic life.
Yes.
But also, so academic complexity, but also rhetorical flourish. So you want to be able to show off some lovely writing, I think, in the context of the piece as well.
Exactly.
So you choose someone who lets you do that. Cool.
And then I suppose... just on that page 88 where Vanni says, I'm not sure you're good at distinguishing your friends from your enemies, Mr. Galileo. Yeah.
It's interesting, we referred to that idea that he has influence up here. So there's this idea that you've friends in every branch of business. And then Vanni says, it's a very astute, incisive comment here about how, he's not able to distinguish his friends from his enemies. One thing that we've talked about in class is the idea that the real mistake that Galileo makes is not pursuing the new science, it's lampooning the church's view of science in his discoursing. So I can't remember exactly which scene this is played out in, but it talks about the fact that he really it could have been between the Inquisitor and Barberini, actually, when Barberini becomes Pope, but he made the voice of the Pope in the discourse, in the dialogue, to look really stupid.
That's right.
He caricaturized and satirized the church's view, which is a politically stupid thing to do. So if you have the potential to,
I mean, if you're challenging the accepted way of viewing the world, then you need to kind of be seen to be presenting them on a level playing field.
Yes.
And to be fair and balanced. I mean, obviously going to be more persuaded by someone who's going to provide a fair and a balanced point of view than someone who's just completely biased.
Exactly, yeah.
Not to mention what he was up against.
Yes, right, exactly. I mean, they're not, they burnt someone at the stake for that kind of view, so...
Yeah. I think he gets carried away, Galileo, though.
Right.
And he doesn't think things through. I don't think he's very calculated in his actions.
Yeah, he's not a political mind, is he? He is a scientific mind. He is a brilliant mind, but not a political.
And he has that appetite for science, just like he has an appetite for food.
Yes.
So that kind of consumes him and drives him.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily like a well thought out kind of roadmap or anything like that.
Like in scene 5, how he stays behind and risks the plague. Even though
he risks the plague and he doesn't really care that Mrs. Sarti stays behind and that Andrea runs back to, try and find him.
Yeah.
And the fact that his daughter, he lets her go off on his own and doesn't really seem to care about her well-being.
Doesn't even know where she is. Yeah. Exactly.
And then I suppose if we go to page 89, it says the Cardinal Inquisitor comes down the stairs. That's the stage direction.
Oh, yep. Dun, dun. I often do the Imperial March, I think, from Star Wars, when the Inquisitor comes in scenes in my classes. Because I liken this guy to a bit of a Darth Vader figure.
Can you explain why, his symbolic, relevance, his character?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Mr. Bell. I think that he is like the strong arm of the church. So he's the one, and I think at our discussions before you said he incites fear. He's responsible for making people afraid of what the church could do to them.
And I mean, the Inquisition itself was essentially a court of law conducted by the church, which dealt out punishments, often very brutal, graphic punishments.
Yeah.
So, just the Inquisition itself and the Cardinal Inquisitor, sort of the person in charge of the Inquisition, I suppose, of course, is going to
Yep.
be implicated in that kind of feeling of fear.
Yes.
But I guess the important thing to understand with Galileo, though, is that his reason for recanting isn't really out of fear, because he tells us that in scene 14.
Yeah.
That kind of self-abasement scene where he's blaming himself. He says, I was as strong as the authorities. I was never in any real danger.
Yeah, he should have known. Yeah.
So he wasn't very astute. He's not very savvy politically. He should have known if he held out, he was a hero. They weren't actually going to talk to him.
Yeah.
Rather, he caved so easily, and he does that because of his own self-interest, not out of fear, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I guess...
Oh, yeah, okay, so you're saying, yep.
Yeah. So then I guess, suppose later, at the end of the scene now...
Mm-hmm. Ah, yes, this lovely part here.
Then the high official arrives.
No longer
And he's obviously important for the narrative and the plot. And he says, Mr. Galileo, I've been charged to tell you that the court of Florence is no longer in a position to oppose the Holy Inquisition's wish to interrogate you in Rome. The coach of the Holy Inquisition awaits you, Mr. Galileo.
Yeah.
So he's essentially being taken to Rome, almost like a prisoner.
Could we just grab a couple of things here? We probably should wrap this up. But the court of Florence, so they were his allies?
Yeah.
The ones preventing the Inquisition?
Are
interrogation?
they more or less, I imagine, like the Medici family, or those associated with the Medicis?
That's what I was
in positions of power.
Thinking too. Yeah, exactly.
And then, because essentially he's been staying with the Medicis and under their hospitality.
Yeah. We talk about the Holy Inquisition. Notice it's not the church. It's actually the Inquisition itself. So it's a faction within the church. So
the Inquisition, I suppose, was essentially a branch of the church that was designed to, I guess, find heretics. Yeah. People who were saying things that were questioning the church's values. Yeah. And then my understanding is that they were basically tried in a court of law, but it was like a law that a court of law that was governed by the church. Yeah, exactly. Like it's in-house kind of thing. In-house. It's not an impartial, secular legal system like we have today. Yeah. And then they would decide on what sort of punishment would happen to that person who was a heretic. Yeah. The word witch hunt is actually in the text, isn't it? Is that right? I believe so, yeah. I can't quite remember. I don't remember where, but I remember coming across that. Yeah. Okay. And I mean, there was also the Inquisition in Spain as well. Yep. That was a bit different. Yep. But I guess it's just a form of maintaining power, order. Yep. Maintaining the church's strength. Yep. Yep. Exactly. And trying to incite fear within kind of the community. Fear, which leads to power. And I suppose the word interrogate is important there as well. They're not going to be questioning him, they're not going to be discussing, they're interrogating him. Right. There's very, I guess, connotations of violence or pressure. And I suppose that links in perfectly with encountering conflict. Yeah, right. So here's where the conflict is almost at a peak. Not this particular, but the interrogation is escalating. Yeah. And it's almost at a peak, I think. And the recantation, I think, is probably the moment of climax, I'd probably say. Yeah, cool. So we'll go escalating towards the recantation. Wonderful. And cool. I think that's pretty much it for the scene. Yeah. That was a very insightful discussion. Hopefully that helps.